Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about a period known as Reconstruction. So, this is a period that follows the Civil War and lasts until about 1877. And one of the big reasons that it's important is because it's how we figure out how to negotiate the United States after the end of slavery. So, Reconstruction's official definition is the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War and reintegrating it into the Union. So, we're going to see a bunch of different issues arise. One of the big things is there are going to be differing ideas of how to reintegrate the South into the United States. So, a lot of the time, we have this idea that the North and the South were completely against each other, and that everybody in the North agreed with each other, and everybody in the South agreed with each other. But that simply wasn't the case. We were fairly unified in the North on the idea that the South was wrong in the Civil War and that we should be fighting it. Now, there were people that believed that we shouldn't be fighting a war. We call them copperheads, and that's all History 121. That's all Civil War. But there were people who didn't think we shouldn't be at war with the South. But for the most part, we generally agree South was wrong, and we have to figure out how to bring them back into the United States. But we have different ideas about how to do that. So people are going to fight about that. We're also, though, in addition to fighting with each other, we're going to be fighting against the South. The South is going to be pushing against Northern authority. As far as they're concerned, the Civil War happened, it's done, it's over with. Now we're the United States again, and so the South should just be part of that again. And we're going to see a huge rationalization of the South's loss because of that. We're also going to see a lot of racism and a fight to return to the pre-emancipation system of race relations. And this is what's really going to characterize Reconstruction. Reconstruction is going to be this weird period of a little more than 10 years where slaves have just been freed and they all of a sudden have an unprecedented amount of power and freedom. And at the end of Reconstruction, all of that is going to just vanish. And you're going to have another 100 or so years of complete distancing between white and black. And you're going to see the advent of things like Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are official segregation that say that white and black people can't like live in the same space, or they use like the big thing that most people think of is they use different water fountains, things like that. But so during Reconstruction, you're going to see a fight to return to that. And at the end of Reconstruction, that's when we really do a lot to um, return to the way things were during slavery without calling it slavery. All right, so we do need to talk just a little bit about the Civil War because to understand Reconstruction, we have to understand what happened with the Civil War. There's this idea, it's called continuity. It's the idea that you study history not as something that's linear, not as like a timeline, but by the idea that things are interconnected and that change happens over time, and so we need to understand the changes that are happening during the Civil War and how that impacts people during Reconstruction. So there are several short-term and long-term causes of the war, but I do want you to understand the overarching cause of the Civil War is, was, and always will be slavery. All right. 100% that is what caused it. Slavery is the root cause of all of these other things. Everything, short term and long term, all relate back to it. So, the short term causes of the Civil War are kind of like if you've ever seen an episode of Looney Tunes that has the Roadrunner and the Coyote. The Coyote is always trying to use dynamite to blow up the Roadrunner. And so he uses this stick of dynamite that has this really, really long wick, and he lights it really far away, and then it slowly travels to where it's supposed to blow up. Now, the coyote always ends up blowing himself up. But the short-term causes of the Civil War are kind of like that stick of dynamite. So we start with lighting that dynamite with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes one of the most divisive things that we see between the North and the South before the Civil War. And it's actually going to lead to something called Bleeding Kansas, where there's essentially a miniature civil war being fought between people from the North and the South over whether Kansas is going to be a slave state. And a bunch of stuff happens between the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the election of Abraham Lincoln. And so all of that is that long wick that I was talking about. Some really cool stuff happens. One of my favorite things to talk about is the caning of Charles Sumner. Um, this guy, Charles Sumner, gets up in front of Congress. He gives a speech. It's called The Crimes Against Kansas. One of the guys in the audience, Sumner, is kind of talking badly about one of his relatives. And so he goes after the speech and he literally just wails on Sumner with a gold-headed cane. And so a whole bunch of stuff happens. People are upset, divided, and it starts to become this idea that the North and the South can't get along. They can't coexist peacefully. And so then you get the dynamite actually exploding, and that's the election of Abraham Lincoln. Once Lincoln is elected as a Republican under the idea of the non extension of slavery, everything kind of explodes and the South secedes from the Union. As you can see, both of these things have to do with the concept of slavery. The Kansas Nebraska Act splits Kansas and Nebraska into two different territories, and in Kansas, you get fighting about whether it should be a slave state. The election of Lincoln, he is going to run on the idea of non extension of slavery. Same thing with the long-term causes of the war. The two major long-term causes are economics and sectional differences. So both of these, like I said, they're long-term. They're underlying causes that really begin with America. The North and the South over time coalesce into very, very different places, largely because they have different climates, they have different needs, they produce different things. And so, economically, one is very agrarian, meaning that there are lots of farms. There's especially cotton being grown, that's the South. And then the North becomes very industrialized. And as such, they have very different needs. But ultimately, it all comes back to the idea of slavery because the North really doesn't need slavery in industry, but the South feels that they need slaves to be able to continue with the production of cotton. You've also got sectional differences. This is where you get the idea of states' rights. This is something that if you grew up in the South, you've probably heard before. The idea that states have the right to secede. Doesn't matter if they were wrong for the reason that they seceded, doesn't matter if they were wrong in the Civil War. States should have the right to leave the Union if they're unhappy with what's being done. That's the concept of secession and the concept of states' rights. And that's one of the big things that we have to do with sectional differences. The difference between wanting states to have more power and wanting the federal government to have more power. But like I said, ultimately, that kind of boils down to states' rights to own slaves. And so I know that I'm sitting here telling you that slavery is the cause of the Civil War. I'm the teacher, so I mean, at least for the test, you have to believe me, right? But I also want to show you why historians have concluded this. And one of the big things that we do as historians is we look at what are called primary sources. So we have primary sources and secondary sources. Secondary sources are things that are written by historians, things like textbooks or journal articles, monographs are what we call like book length history research. And so you've got those are secondary sources. Primary sources are things that were written or created at the time of an event. So we're going to hear directly from people who were experiencing the Civil War. So first, we're going to talk to our good friend Abraham Lincoln. Most people know that Lincoln was president during the Civil War. And he said in his first inaugural address, "One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them." So at the last part of this, Lincoln is telling us, hey, no matter what, we have to deal with each other. We can't get away from each other. We're right next to each other. And historically, you guys, physically building a wall doesn't actually keep people in or out. The Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall, these aren't very functional walls. You can go under or over or around a wall. So he's like, it doesn't make any sense. We can't just wall off the South and pretend that they don't exist. We're going to have to deal with each other no matter what. And so he tells us what the cause of the Civil War is. He says that it's the only substantial dispute. All right, so this is why we are fighting. And he says that one section believes slavery is right, and one thinks that slavery is wrong. So, what is his conclusion? Slavery caused the Civil War. But you might be saying, well, of course, Lincoln is going to say that. He's the president of the United States. He's the head of the North. So, yeah, he's going to say that the South is wrong, right? He's going to say that the South is fighting for slavery. Well, let's look at what people in the South were saying. Now, there are several ordinances of secession. There's one for every state that secedes from the Union, and all of those mention slavery as one of the top reasons for secession, but we don't want to go through all of those. They're very wordy, they're very long, and that's just a lot. You'll just have to believe me on that one that that's what they say. But I do want to show you something that the vice president of the Confederacy said. All right, so Alexander H. Stephens, he is the vice president of the Confederate States of America, and he gives a speech called the Cornerstone Speech. So if you guys don't know what a cornerstone is, it is the thing that holds up, this is my terrible house. It is the thing that if you remove it, all right, so let's say this is the cornerstone, you remove it and everything falls down, right? A cornerstone holds up a building in architecture. So the idea of a cornerstone for a country, it's the thing that's holding it up. It's what it's all built around. So he says the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution. This is a word you might have never heard before, or a phrase, peculiar institution. Peculiar institution is a fun phrase for slavery, you guys. He says this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea as the Constitution. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. All right, so let's dissect this and see exactly what he's saying. At the end, he says the new government's cornerstone rests. All right, so it's cornerstone up here. It's going to fall down without this. Rests upon the great truth. All right, our great truth is that black people are not equal to white people, and that slavery to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Then he also says in here, you guys, he says very, very clearly, this the idea about the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. All right, so late rupture, that means secession. Present revolution means the Civil War. So ultimately, what is Alexander H. Stephens saying? Slavery, uh-oh, my pen stopped working, is the cause of the Civil War. So after all of that ends, the end of the Civil War, um, we're going to start to see pushback against the idea that the South was wrong. And it's going to manifest itself in something called the lost cause. Now, the lost cause isn't something that goes away during Reconstruction. There's actually going to be some really big instances where we see resurgences of the idea of the lost cause. So we're going to see that in the 1910s and 20s, and we're also going to see it in the 1950s and 60s. All right, so we're going to see it during Reconstruction, but remember that we're going to see it then as well, because every time we see a resurgence of the lost cause, we are going to see a resurgence of a particular group. So we'll talk about them in just a minute. But we need to understand what the lost cause is, and it's the idea that the Confederate cause, what they were fighting for, was heroic and that it was fought against great odds. So it's the idea that, yeah, maybe they lost the Civil War, but the South is right in seceding. Um, and that they had good intentions. It denies responsibility for the war, and it says that slavery was not the cause. So it denies that the South caused the war and that slavery was the cause of it. Instead, it focuses on the benevolence of slavery. You might not know what benevolence means. Essentially, what we're talking about when we talk about benevolence is we're talking about goodness. So we're talking about the idea that slaves were mostly happy and that they weren't really mistreated. A lot of the time, we're going to see slaves depicted as family. Now, was this actually the case? No, not really. Maybe in very few and far between instances, but on the whole, slaves were treated like slaves, you guys. And even on the best day where they are treated like family, they are still property. But we're also going to focus on the idea of Southern hospitality. So, that idea of drinking sweet tea on a porch in a rocking chair, the idea of the Southern belle, and that Southerners are so much nicer than like people in New York, all of that, those ideas, they manifest themselves because of the ideas of the lost cause. And so, what we're going to see in the future, especially in the 20s, a little bit into the 30s, and the 50s and the 60s, is we're going to see a lot of romanticizing um, the idea of the Civil War, or at least the South. So, when you romanticize something, you make it seem a little bit better than it was, maybe. So for example, Gone with the Wind, don't know if any of you guys have ever seen that. But Gone with the Wind is all about Scarlett O'Hara. She is very much the picture of a Southern belle. Um, you're also going to see things like Confederate memorials being built, like the Stone Mountain effigy. Most of these things, they're not done right after the Civil War. Most of these are done in the early 1900s, actually. So if you see like a statue commemorating the Civil War, commemorating the Confederacy, usually it was done way later on. But it has to do with that mentality of the lost cause. That's also where we get the idea that the Confederate flag is a symbol of heritage, not hate. Now, I don't really care where you fall on the idea of whether it's heritage or hate. That sounds a little bit mean, but I don't, because that's something that's a personal idea. What we're talking about here is history, so I'm going to give you fact. The fact is that the flag that we consider to be the Confederate flag is something that starts to be used after the Civil War and during resurgences of this lost cause mentality, um, as a symbol of the South. Sometimes that's used as a symbol of hate. For example, in Georgia, this particular flag is put in the 1950s during the civil rights movement, at the height of the civil rights movement, when people are being asked to integrate schools and things like that. This flag is put on the Georgia state flag, kind of as a symbol of resistance to integration. Another interesting thing is that the Confederate flag actually isn't the Confederate flag. The flag of the Confederacy originally was the stars and bars, and it actually looks a lot like the American flag, just with fewer stars and fewer stripes. Um, and this flag is the Confederate battle flag. It kind of gets adopted during the Civil War as the flag of the Confederacy because the United States and Confederate flags look so much alike. But this is the one that we adopt later on as a symbol of the South. And that symbol arises largely because of the lost cause. Right, so let's talk about the phases of Reconstruction. So I told you guys Reconstruction lasts until 1877. So what we're going to see is three major phases and a compromise. So first, we have wartime Reconstruction. Now, wartime Reconstruction lasts from 1864 to 1865. If you know anything about the Civil War didn't end until 1865. That's exactly why we call it wartime Reconstruction. This is Lincoln's plan to reconstruct the South. So it's his plan because he doesn't actually get to put it into practice. This is us kind of jumping the gun. We know that the Civil War is going to end, so we need to have a plan in place for how to bring the South back into the Union. There's actually going to be a lot of fighting about this. So Lincoln is in charge of wartime Reconstruction. He's going to come up with a 10% plan. The 10% plan essentially says that 10% of each state's population would have to sign an oath of loyalty, more or less be like, hey, sorry for that whole Civil War thing. So they'd have to sign an oath basically saying that they're not going to secede again and that they are deeply and truly sorry that the Civil War happened, and then they get to be a state again. A lot of people, especially a group known as radical Republicans, they're going to have problems with that. So the radical Republicans are in charge of a majority of congressional seats at this point in time. So Lincoln is a Republican, so are these guys. They just disagree with each other about how to handle things like Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans are going to come up with something called the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill is kind of the counter to Lincoln's 10% plan. And what it's going to require is a 50% oath of loyalty, but also it's going to operate on an idea called the state suicide theory. Essentially, what that theory says is when Southern states seceded from the Union, they ceased to exist. So Georgia seceded from the United States, and Georgia, the state, no longer existed. They might have called themselves Georgia, but they were Georgia, the Confederate state, and that's two completely different things. So what that would mean is that when we let these states back into the Union, they don't get to come in as full states. They don't get to come in as the state that they were before. They have to go through a whole bunch of hoops to try to get back into the Union. It also uses the idea of conquered provinces. And conquered provinces are what you use in wartime when you go and you take over an area, you conquer that area, and you get to go in and take them over for a while. You get to maybe put a government in place. At the very least, they're not going to be running themselves. And so that is what the Wade Davis bill would have relied on. Now, the Wade Davis bill was pocket vetoed by Abraham Lincoln. So when the president gets a piece of legislation, he has a couple of options. Most of the time, the president will sign a bill into law. Um, if it's passed through Congress, usually it has the support of the president by that point, so he signs it and it becomes a law. The other thing that he can do, though, is he can use his veto of legislation. The veto of legislation is basically the president sending the bill back to Congress and saying, hey, this isn't good enough. You should change it. I don't like it. Um, Now, Congress has some power that would overturn his veto. If Congress gets a certain fraction of the vote, they can actually overturn the president's veto and sign the bill into law without the president's approval. And that's something that would have very likely happened to the Wade Davis bill because of the high percentage of radical Republicans in Congress at the time. Lincoln knew that. He didn't want to sign the Wade Davis bill into law, and he didn't want to veto it because he didn't want to send it back to Congress. Now, Congress, though, isn't in session all year long. And you also have re-elections for Congress every 2 years, as opposed to every 4 years, like you do with the president. Now, the presidential re-election had actually recently happened in 1864, so Lincoln had just been re-elected. What he wanted to do was he wanted to stall until new people had come into Congress and would hopefully amend the Wade Davis bill rather than pass it over his veto. And so he pocket vetoes it. The name for pocket veto comes from the idea that the president just kind of takes the bill, folds it up, and puts it in his pocket to forget about it until Congress is no longer in session. Um, what that would have done is it would have meant that Congress wouldn't be in session again until after the elections that would happen in 1866. I like to think that Lincoln took the bill, folded it up, and put it under his little stovepipe hat. That's probably not historically accurate, but it paints a nice picture for me, and it helps me remember what happened with the Wade Davis bill and the pocket veto. So ultimately, none of these things actually come to fruition. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated just a short time after the South's surrender. And so a guy named Andrew Johnson becomes president. So Andrew Johnson is the vice president of the United States under Lincoln, and he's going to become president after he's assassinated. And so he's going to take over Reconstruction in the presidential Reconstruction phase. So this is 65 to 66. Now, he's not in charge for very long because everybody kind of hated Andrew Johnson. Um, Andrew Johnson was technically a Southerner. Something that a lot of people don't know about the Union during the Civil War is that there were actually several slaveholding states who didn't secede from the Union. And so Andrew Johnson was from one of those. So in the North, he's seen as, crazy Southern slaveholder who's not going to side with them. And in the South, he's kind of seen as a traitor. So he's kind of getting it from both ends, and nobody really likes him that much. He's also kind of a super racist, and he does not do well against the radical Republicans. They constantly butt heads, and he more or less tries to end Reconstruction before it ever begins. He gets a lot of flack for that from the radical Republicans, and they are actually going to impeach him. Now, impeachment is something that a lot of people don't really understand, even though that an impeachment process has recently happened. Um, Andrew Johnson was actually the first president to ever be impeached, but that doesn't mean that he was removed from office. A president is impeached when it is brought before the House of Representatives and they decide whether there is enough evidence to submit articles of impeachment and have a trial in the Senate. We have had three presidents who were impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, was not removed from office, but he was impeached. Kind of like with Bill Clinton was impeached, he just wasn't removed. Same thing with Johnson, but it did take away a lot of his power as far as Reconstruction. And so after that impeachment process, Congress is going to take over. Now, I know that that doesn't make that much sense when you look at the name Military Reconstruction. Military Reconstruction is sometimes also called Congressional Reconstruction. Not sure your book might actually refer to it as Congressional Reconstruction. I like to call it Military Reconstruction because I am a firm believer in the idea that the simplest name for something is what we should call it. Military Reconstruction tells us what they did. So the big thing about military reconstruction is that the South was split up into five military run districts. A general was in charge of each of those districts, and the military was present, making sure that the South adhered to all the new laws that were being put into place. So the 13th Amendment is passed around the end of the Civil War and it frees the slaves. We'll talk about all those amendments in a minute. Military Reconstruction requires that the South ratify the 14th Amendment and also that they guarantee suffrage for blacks. Suffrage means the right to vote. It does stop short of giving any sort of land or education at the government's expense to freed slaves, but you have a good 10-year period where the South has the Union Army. making sure that slavery is ended and that African Americans are given basic rights. The problem is going to come at the end of Reconstruction, when the military pulls out of the South. Now, that happens in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. So this is the result of a weird election. The election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden are running against one another. You have probably never heard of Sam Tilden. That's because he did not get to be president when he grows up. However, he did have the majority of the votes. He just didn't have enough electoral votes to become president. Now, when that happens, um, the presidency is actually thrown to Congress and they make a decision about who becomes president. Now, the inner workings of all that is more of a political science question, so we just need to have a very basic understanding of Sam Tilden kind of won, but he didn't win, so Congress is supposed to decide. And the idea is that Congress is answerable to the American people, and so theoretically, Congress would say, hey, Sam Tilden won, so he should be president. Instead, what Congress does is they kind of have a conversation amongst themselves and they work out a deal. In that deal, Rutherford B. Hayes is put into the presidency in exchange for the official end of Reconstruction. The people who agree to end Reconstruction think that giving African Americans the vote and giving them civil rights is enough to give them equality in the South. Here's the problem with that. They underestimate the racism of the South, the commitment to that racism, and they also kind of underestimate, um, well, no, they overestimate how much good the things that they've done for African Americans has done. Um, they didn't give them any sort of land or education. Slaves weren't allowed to learn how to read or write. They had no education to speak of. If they didn't have any land and they didn't have any learning, they really couldn't get jobs. And jobs are how you sustain yourself. If you don't have a way to sustain yourself, you're very vulnerable. And the South is really going to take advantage of that. So during Reconstruction, there are several amendments and acts passed. There's some civil rights cases that we're going to see heard. So I want to talk about all of those together. Now, these do happen over the course of Reconstruction. But we're just kind of putting them all here so that we can see what they are. Also, we're looking at these amendments, and we're going to look at the very basic ideas for them, and we're going to look at them as they apply to Reconstruction and race relations. So these amendments, a lot of them say a lot more. We're just going to kind of get it down to the bare bones of what you need to understand. So we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment frees all the slaves in the South. The 14th Amendment addresses citizenship and civil rights. This is going to be really, really important later on to the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. It has in it something called the Equal Protection Clause, and that's going to be super important. Um, you've also got the 15th Amendment. This is going to give black men the right to vote. Now, it doesn't say in there, hey, we're giving black dudes the right to vote. Um, it does have some fancy wording about not discriminating by color of the skin, race, stuff like that. But essentially, black men are allowed to vote. Women aren't going to get the vote for a while. We've also got the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This one surprises a lot of people because it's a Civil Rights Act. And so you would think that there's no need for a civil rights movement 100 years later, but there is. What the Civil Rights Act does is it makes it a crime to deny full and equal use of public conveyances and places. Essentially, what that does, you guys, is it makes telling people that they can't go to a store or that they can't drink from a water fountain or that they can't go to a school illegal, which is kind of baffling, right? Because most of us know that the next 100 years are going to be filled with segregation. um, we're going to have Jim Crow laws that make segregation a legal thing. And the reason for that is because right after the Civil Rights Act is passed, we're going to see a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is going to make Jim Crow laws essentially legal through the ruling of separate but equal. Separate but equal means that it is okay to make people based on race, gender, whatever. It's okay to make people use different water fountains or sit at different lunch counters, things like that. It's okay to do that as long as everything is equal. Um, Now, obviously, everything's not going to be equal, but nobody's really going to check up on it. There will be separate public conveyances and places, and as long as there is one for Black people to use, they're technically not violating the Civil Rights Act because of the separate but equal ruling. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about something called the Freedmen's Bureau. So I'm going to tell you guys on the next slide exactly what it is, but first I want to look a little bit at this uh, cartoon. So this was something that would have been published in a Southern newspaper. So a couple things that I want you to notice, but I'm not going to tell you who wrote it or what their purpose is, because I want you to do that for your written prompt. All right, so I want you guys to notice what's being said about what the Freedmen's Bureau is. I also want you guys to notice this guy. This is a freed slave. So I want you to look at what he looks like. I want you to look at what he's doing. I also want you to notice him in comparison to these white farmers. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on. You guys are going to come back to that in the PowerPoint and make sure that you use that to answer your prompt question that has to do with the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau is an organization that was created during Reconstruction to help former slaves and poor whites in the aftermath of the Civil War. Now I have this underlined, but that's also just kind of so the Freedmen's Bureau. It's admittedly kind of a misnomer because this freedmen makes you think of freed slaves, right? Freedmen. So you think of freed slaves, right? But it's also going to help poor whites. It's going to help a vast majority of the South if they will let it, because most of the South was poor white people. It's going to give food, housing, medical aid. There's also going to be the hmm, establishment. Yeah, there's going to be the establishment of schools. They're going to offer legal assistance, all sorts of stuff. They attempt to settle former slaves on confiscated or abandoned land. This one is the idea of, you may have heard of it, 40 acres and a mule. It's something that does not actually come to fruition, but it's going to try. It is going to be prevented from fully carrying out their programs, though, because of shortages of funds and personnel, along with the politics of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson is going to be very against the Freedmen's Bureau, and so is the South. And so the South is going to manipulate the perception of the Freedmen's Bureau in the South. So anyone who aided in Reconstruction, whether they're from the North or the South, was seen as trying to take advantage of the already weakened region, and they're vilified. So you're going to have the carpetbaggers in the North, and scalawags are from the South. So Southerners who jump on the Reconstruction bandwagon. A lot of this time, there's going to be like the poor Southern whites who try to take advantage of the Freedmen's Bureau programs. They're going to be considered scalawags. Um, the carpetbaggers from the North are usually portrayed as coming down to try to make money off of the troubles of the South. And so this on the left is a political cartoon representing that. So you've got this giant carpetbag. They're called carpetbaggers because their suitcases that they would bring down were usually made of carpet. So you've got this giant carpet bag. And it says on here carpet bag and bayonet rule. So these are bayonets. Um, And so you've got this idea that you've got the carpetbaggers coming down to the South, and they are ruling through obviously fear and violence with these bayonets. They're also being helped by these guys, are Union soldiers. This guy down here is a Southerner. You can see it says right here the solid South. So you've got this Southerner who is carrying the carpetbagger, and he's held in chains by the Union. I always thought this was kind of funny because he's being held and basically turned into a slave by the Union, um, but the South was okay with doing the same thing to actual slaves. So he is carrying the weight of the carpetbaggers, and so the South is, according to Southerners, being taken advantage of by the North. This is also going to be where we see the advent of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I told you guys there's a group that we see every time there's a resurgence of the lost cause mentality, and it's these guys, the friendly neighborhood KKK. So these guys are going to start in 1867 as a social club for former Confederate soldiers. This is kind of their cover, I guess. They are former Confederates who kind of band together. And what it's going to turn into is what they call the Invisible Empire of the South. So the Invisible Empire of the South is supposed to aid the South politically. So these are the guys, the former Confederates, who are trying to get back into the government and ensure that the South maintains control of the South instead of being taken over by the Union. You can see where this might cause problems, especially for freed slaves. And they're going to use violence to frighten Black people and keep them from exercising their civil rights. So they're going to physically attack them. We're going to see a rise in something called lynchings. Lynchings are basically public executions without any sort of a trial. A lot of the time, they're going to be surrounded by a lot of mob violence. Um, and this is something that actually really doesn't happen very much before the Civil War. There was really no need for it because slaves were completely beholden to their masters. So slaves could be executed for whatever the master wanted. But also, the slave masters tried very hard not to kill slaves because they were property. Now that they're not property, there's really no reason for the South not to kill them. That sounds terrible and horrible because they're people, and there's always a reason not to kill people. But as far as they're concerned, they're not people, and they're dangerous. There are ideas floating around the South that freeing slaves is going to turn them into cannibals. That freeing the slaves means that Black men are going to come and try to rape all of the white women. These are ideas that are very prevalent fears among Southerners. And so the KKK is going to emerge as the supposed protectors against this. They dress in white sheets and hooded masks, and they terrorize Black people and white people who try to help them. And we're going to see that every time there's a resurgence of the KKK. They're not just going to hate Black people, they're going to hate anybody who allies with them. So they're going to use intimidation, physical violence, and murder to reestablish the social control that they used to have over slaves and their white allies. And segregation, largely due to the Ku Klux Klan, is going to become the norm. We're also going to see a series of codes called Black Codes passed to regulate the affairs of freed Blacks in an attempt to reestablish that pre-emancipation system of race relations. We're going to look at a couple of examples of Black Codes in just a second, but it's going to severely limit their ability to own or even rent land. They're going to be required to have jobs. And so, what you're going to see as a result of Black Codes is a system called sharecropping. Um, Sharecropping is going to very intentionally perpetuate a cycle of debt through something called crop lien laws. Crop lien laws basically mean that if you owe money to a landowner, you have to stay on that land until you no longer owe money, until you pay off that debt. Um, and so these sharecroppers, these black people, are going to end up tied to plantations as more or less slaves to the land rather than slaves to the owners. So they're slaves, but we don't call it slavery. And this is going to last for about 100 years. The way that the sharecropping cycle works is you have sharecroppers who are allowed to plant and live on a landowner's land in exchange for a percentage of the profit. So you have that freed slave come most likely to his former owner, which you can imagine is kind of a terrible conversation to have to have. So they go, they ask for a job, and the landowner allows them to live on a piece of land. They can farm that land as long as they give them, let's say, half of the profit, right? But they don't have any money. Remember, they weren't given money or land or education at federal expense, and so slaves are coming into this agreement with absolutely nothing. That means that they're going to have to borrow from the landowner to be able to buy basic necessities, to be able to buy the seeds that they need to plant, to be able to buy food to make it throughout the year. So they're already starting out in the negative. So they don't just have $0, they have less than that. Then they're going to plant and harvest the land. But one of the big things that you're going to see amongst Black codes is that African Americans aren't going to be allowed to sell or barter. So they're not going to be able to go and take their crops, whatever it is that they grow themselves. They're going to have to give them to the landowner. So they give the crops to the landowner to sell. The landowner may or may not be honest about the profit. Who knows? But I mean, these are the same guys who owned human beings. So let's face it, if the numbers don't work out for them by being honest, they're probably going to lie. So usually the profit is going to be less than the expenses. Um, so what'll happen, let's say, math is hard, you guys. So let's say that we make $10 on our crop. Well, we have to give $5 to the landowner because we have to give him half of the profits, right? So we have $5. Well, let's say it cost us $7 to buy all of this stuff. So now we're left with negative $2. So because of crop lien laws, we have to stay on the land. And so we start this cycle all over again. We live and plant on the land, but we don't have any money. We're at negative $2, you guys. So we have to borrow more money. We're deeper in the hole. We plant, we have the owner sell, and the cycle keeps going. All right, so this is an example of those black codes I was telling you about. This is actually a few different black codes. First, you're going to see the word parish throughout this. Parish is basically a county. This is an example from Louisiana, but black codes were fairly consistent throughout the South. So we're going to look at what is limited by these. So first, that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within the limits of said parish without special permit in writing from his employer. This is essentially a permission slip to be able to go anywhere. So we're going to severely limit Black mobility. No Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within said parish. So they're not allowed to rent land. They're not allowed to live wherever they want. This is going to limit mobility, but it's also going to limit where they can live and what jobs they can have. Also, no Negro who is not in the military service shall be allowed to carry firearms or any kind of weapons within the parish. So this is going to limit their ability to defend themselves. Um, Now, notice they can't have guns. Y'all, this is definitely a Second Amendment violation right here. So you're not allowed to have guns, but also you're not allowed to have any kind of weapons. Now, what constitutes a weapon? If I took a fork and I stabbed somebody in the hand with it, that fork is definitely a weapon, right? Or let's say you have what amounts to a giant fork. You have a pitchfork because you're a farmer and you're farming, but it can be construed as a weapon. Almost anything could be construed as a weapon. So that's going to be used to prosecute lots of African Americans who otherwise weren't really doing anything. Also, no Negro shall sell, barter, or exchange any articles of merchandise or traffic within said parish. All right, so this is going to go back to the idea of sharecropping, because they can't make their own money. And money is a huge thing to limit. So just with these four, and there are more black codes, just with these four, we've already determined that black people can't go where they want to go. They can't live where they want to live. They can't have the job that they want to have. They can't defend themselves, and they don't have the ability to make money on their own. In addition to all of that, we are also going to disenfranchise African Americans. Disenfranchise means keep them from being able to vote. Disenfranchisement is a huge thing because one of the big ideas that Northerners had about ending Reconstruction is that as long as Black people could vote, and they were given that right with the 14th Amendment, as long as they could vote, they could protect themselves from racism in the South. Well, we're going to keep them from voting in the South. We're going to use intimidation, violence. We're also going to use poll taxes, essentially charging people to be able to vote. If you are a freed slave, who doesn't have the ability to make a lot of money on your own, who's always in debt as a sharecropper, you don't have the money to pay poll taxes. There are also going to be property requirements where you have to own property or even own a certain amount of land to be able to vote. That's problematic because these sharecroppers aren't allowed to rent or buy their own land. You're also going to have something called grandfather clauses, which basically mean that if your grandfather wasn't registered to vote in a region, you're not allowed to register to vote there either. These freed slaves, their grandfathers were not allowed to vote because their grandfathers were slaves, so they weren't registered. So it never actually says, hey, black people can't vote. None of these things say that black people can't vote, but it keeps them from being able to do so. There's also something called gerrymandering. This is gerrymandering. It's essentially restructuring a district to get your desired outcome. And so you can see how that could happen in this example. The way that the districts are drawn can impact who wins. In all three of these examples, we have 60% blue squares, 40% red squares. But in this example, because of the way that we've drawn our districts, 5 districts are blue, 0 districts are red, so blue wins. In this example, 3 districts are red, 2 districts are blue, so red wins. But ultimately, regardless, 60% of them are blue. So how does red win? We restructure our districts. You're also going to have something called literacy tests. This is an example of a literacy test. Now you can see this is 24 through 30 of the literacy test. Now literacy tests varied from place to place, but obviously this one has at least 30 questions. So I want you guys to take a look at it. These are really difficult questions. Um, a lot of them are worded kind of funny. Some of them have multiple possible answers. So for example, print a word that looks the same whether it is printed frontwards or backwards. So most classes do pretty well with that. Usually the example that I get is race car. You could also use like dad or mom. So we're doing pretty good, right? We're acing this literacy test. All right, write down on the line provided what you read in the triangle below. So take a second to read that. Now, one thing that the human brain likes to do is if there are extra words, it likes to skip over them. So if you read Paris in the spring, you're wrong because it says Paris in the spring. Next question. In the third square below, write the second letter of the fourth word. So in our third square, we're going to write the second letter of the fourth word. So 1, 2, 3, 4, second letter. We're going to write a Q. But you might be able to argue that the sentence says write the second letter of the fourth word. So in that case, the second letter is an H. You see, we have 2 possible answers. Write right from the left to the right as you see it spelled here. That one just kind of makes my eyes cross a little bit, and I don't want to answer it, but it's a little bit confusing. Divide a vertical line in two equal parts by bisecting it with a curved horizontal line that is only straight at its spot bisection of the vertical. That sounds like the devil's math to me. I don't know about you guys, but those are some big words. Here's the thing, you guys, even if you have a former slave who can read, most likely they are not highly educated. These big words, they're not going to be able to understand the devil's math either. Write every other word in this first line and print every third word in same line. Original type smaller in first line ended at comma, but capitalize the fifth word that you write. So you can see this one is very, very involved. And if you miss even the smallest step, that entire question is wrong. My favorite one, though, draw 5 circles that one common interlocking part. That is not a sentence, my friends. It's not. Now, your brain might tell you that it says draw 5 circles that have one common interlocking part, but that's not actually a sentence. It doesn't really tell you to do anything. So that is all that I have for you guys today. Make sure you go in and do your quiz and do your writing prompt, and I will see you guys next time.